On Thanksgiving night, as the table filled with laughter and clinking glasses, his grandson leaned over to his sister and whispered with a smirk, "Don't worry about him. He's just Grandpa." The words, careless and sharp, sliced deeper than any insult could. He sat only a few feet away, the turkey steaming before him, the candles flickering soft light across his lined face. Yet it felt as though a wall had been built between him and his own blood. They thought he didn't hear. They thought age had dulled his ears as it had slowed his steps. But he heard every syllable, and each one struck like a nail being hammered into wood already splintering with time. The family around him carried on as if nothing had been said. His son-in-law spoke loudly about business deals. His daughter nodded with polite smiles. The younger children reached across the table for more bread. No one noticed the way his hands stilled on his fork. No one saw how his chest rose and fell a little heavier. They had reduced him to a title without weight, just Grandpa, a presence tolerated but not cherished, an old chair in the corner of a house once built on his labor. He looked at them all, his daughter, who once clung to his hand as a child, his grandchildren who had no memory of the sacrifices that had shaped their lives, his son-in-law who carried himself with the pride of a man who thought history began with him. Their laughter rang loud, but beneath it he heard the silence of something far colder, the erasure of his worth. His stories were dismissed as noise, his wisdom as outdated rambling, his very existence as a shadow lingering too long. What they did not know, what they had chosen not to see, was that his life was not an empty shell. The wrinkles on his face were not just time, they were maps of survival, of war endured, of bridges built, of lives touched. In drawers upstairs lay letters of gratitude, photographs yellowed with age, even medals tarnished but unforgotten. He carried within him a story larger than the room, a story that strangers would one day bow their heads to hear. But here, at this table, he was invisible. He was just Grandpa. He took a sip of water to steady himself, his eyes lowering to the plate. He would not argue. Pride would not let him beg for acknowledgement in his own family. His dignity, scarred but unbroken, kept him silent. Yet within that silence, something shifted. The pain was real, but so was the certainty that the world has a way of circling back, that truth has a way of stepping into the light. And though his family's laughter made him small in that moment, he knew a day was coming when the same name they had belittled would stand taller than their pride, and the words, "just Grandpa," would choke in their throats. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with your friends, because by doing so, you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, we continue. They placed him by the window, not at the center of the table where laughter and conversation overlapped, but at the edge where the draft crept in through the glass and the shadows of the evening pressed close. It was not a deliberate insult, at least not in their eyes, just a casual choice made without thought, as though his presence mattered less than the convenience of space. But to him it was louder than words. Once he had carved the very wood of this table, carried it into the house with his own back, polished it until it gleamed. Now he sat apart from it, exiled to a corner like a guest instead of the patriarch. He tried to speak, gently at first, recalling a story from years gone by, the kind of story that had once made his daughter's eyes light up, the kind his grandchildren could have carried in their hearts like lessons. But his words barely found air before another voice leapt over him. His son-in-law spoke louder, filling the space with talk of business, of deals, of money. The children laughed at a joke from their phones, oblivious. His story, cut short, faded into the hum of the room as if it had never been spoken. He lowered his gaze to his plate, the unspoken truth pressing harder with every breath. His past was considered dull, his presence unnecessary, his voice irrelevant. Outside the window, snow began to fall, each flake drifting in silence, catching the glow of the streetlights. He stared at it, almost grateful for the distraction, for the way it mirrored his own quiet descent into invisibility. No one noticed that his fork lay untouched. No one noticed that he had stopped trying to join in. They were too busy with their noise, with the urgency of lives they believed mattered more than his. He sat with the snow and the silence, companions truer to him than the people at the table. What hurt was not the interruption itself, but the way it revealed how far he had fallen in their eyes. To them, he was not the man who had fought through winters harsher than this one, who had carried bricks and mortar to raise the very house they sat in. He was not the man who had bled, worked, sacrificed so they could live in comfort. He was simply old, too slow for their conversations, too heavy with stories that no one wanted to carry. They saw him not as a root, but as clutter. Yet, even as pain pressed against him, he held on to dignity. He would not plead for their ears, would not ask them to remember. He had lived long enough to know that truth does not need permission. His silence now was not weakness, but waiting. Waiting for the moment when his life, dismissed as boring and irrelevant, would return with the force of memory. A moment when those who interrupted him would no longer be able to ignore him, when the stories he carried would no longer be cut off, because they would be spoken for him, on a stage larger than this table, before eyes wider than this room. For now, though, he sat by the window, the draft on his back, the laughter behind him, and the snow outside reminding him of the passage of time. They thought they had placed him at the edge, but they had only set the stage for the moment when the man by the window would be the only one anyone came to see. The silence grew inside him like a second heartbeat. It throbbed in his chest as he sat by the window, listening to the hum of voices that passed over him as if he were not there. He did not argue, did not interrupt, did not try to wrestle space back from those who had already claimed it. He folded his hands in his lap and lowered his gaze, and to them it looked like resignation. They mistook his quiet for emptiness, his stillness for weakness, but within that silence memories crowded, alive, unyielding, heavy as stone. He remembered the war, the nights when the sky split open with fire and men screamed into the darkness. He remembered carrying a friend on his back through mud that swallowed boots whole, his breath burning in his lungs, his arms trembling but never letting go. He remembered the metal pressed into his hand, not for glory but for survival, for doing what had to be done when the world itself seemed to be ending. That metal lay tarnished now in a drawer upstairs, hidden away because no one cared to ask. They had never asked. He remembered the years of labor, his hands calloused, skin cracked from cold winters spent building walls, pouring foundations, lifting stones heavier than his own body. He remembered walking home in the snow with bread under his arm and little else, but smiling anyway because his children would eat. He remembered the ache in his back, the stiffness in his knees, the exhaustion in his bones, but also the pride that came with knowing the roof over their heads had been raised by his sweat. And now, in this same house, they laughed past him as though that roof had always been there, as though it had fallen from the sky for their comfort. He remembered the nights of hunger when he had skipped meals so his daughter could have more, when he had worked double shifts in silence so she could study, when he had walked home past darkened shop windows and told himself that someday it would be worth it. He remembered the small victories, the promotions earned without thanks, the debts paid down, the quiet triumph of survival. Those memories still burned with a fire no one at the table could see, because no one at the table cared to look. The bitterness rose like smoke, curling in his chest, but pride kept it from spilling out. He would not defend himself to people who had already judged him irrelevant. He would not place his life on trial at his own table. To speak would be to beg, and begging was beneath him. So he sat in silence, letting the weight of memory press down, letting their laughter wash past him like waves against a stone. They thought he was fading. They thought he was done. But his silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a man who knew that truth is patient, that dignity outlasts mockery, that one day the stories he carried would break free, not through his voice, but through others who could not contain their awe. And as he watched his family pass dishes and chatter about small things, he realized something that steadied him. Their laughter was shallow, but his silence was deep. Their pride was loud, but his dignity was louder still. They could not hear it now, but the day was coming when the silence they ignored would thunder across a hall filled with strangers, and then they would finally understand what they had dismissed. It came casually, without malice in tone, yet sharp enough to cut to the bone. The son-in-law leaned back in his chair, his glass in hand, and when the old man began to murmur something about how different the world had once been, he waved it off with a laugh. "You wouldn't understand," he said lightly, though his words carried the weight of dismissal. "It's not your time anymore." The room chuckled with him, as if he had said something witty, something harmless, but to the man by the window, those words were a verdict. Not your time, not your world, not your voice. In that instant, decades of sacrifice were dismissed in a sentence. His daughter looked away. She did not correct her husband, did not speak up to soften the blow. Instead, she turned her head, her eyes fixed on her plate, her silence echoing louder than the remark itself. This was the child he had carried on his shoulders, the girl for whom he had worked double shifts, the one he had promised himself he would protect from hunger, from hardship, and now she could not even lift her eyes to meet his. Her quiet compliance felt colder than rejection. It told him what he had feared but not admitted, that even she, his own flesh, had grown accustomed to erasing him. The grandchildren snickered as they noticed his coat draped on the back of his chair. It was an old wool coat, patched at the elbows, a little frayed at the collar. To them it was a relic, something unfashionable, laughable. They whispered to each other, muffling giggles, mocking the way the fabric sagged, the way it smelled faintly of mothballs and turpentine. They saw only what was worn. They did not see the winters it had endured, the storms it had braved, the nights it had shielded their grandfather as he trudged home from long shifts, carrying groceries in one hand and exhaustion in the other. That coat had known hunger, had known pride, had known survival. To them it was just a joke. He sat still, his fork resting untouched beside his plate. His chest ached, not from the words alone, but from the casual ease with which they were spoken, the laughter that followed, the silence of those who should have defended him. He did not lash out. His pride would not let him. Instead, he folded the insult into the same silence he had been carrying all evening, adding it to the growing weight pressing against his heart. What none of them understood was that time is not erased by fashion, nor by arrogance. His life was not made irrelevant by new technologies or louder voices. The bridges he had built still stood. The men he had saved in war still lived because of him. The foundations he had laid still carried houses where families like theirs found warmth. His world had not vanished. It was written into the very streets they walked, the very roofs over their heads. But they, blind in their pride, could not see it. As their laughter settled into the hum of conversation, he turned his gaze back to the window. Outside, the snow had thickened, each flake falling with quiet persistence, layering the earth until the ground was covered in a white silence too vast to ignore. He thought of his own silence, steady as snowfall, covering years of hurt, of effort, of sacrifice. They thought it was emptiness. They thought it was weakness. They did not yet know it was dignity. And though his chest ached with the sting of their dismissal, something steadier stirred within him. He did not need to argue, did not need to prove. One day the truth they denied would speak without his help. One day they would sit in an audience and his story would be told not by him but by others whose voices carried weight. And when that day came, the words, "not your time," would crumble into nothing against the undeniable fact that his time had never ended. It had only been waiting. Upstairs, beyond the noise of clinking dishes and muffled laughter, in the quiet corner of a bedroom no one entered any more, there stood an old wooden chest of drawers. Its handles were worn smooth by decades of touch, its surface scarred by the weight of objects set carelessly upon it. To the family, it was nothing more than furniture, another relic of the past, too heavy to move, too outdated to admire. But inside, hidden from their careless eyes, rested the fragments of a life they had chosen to forget. In the top drawer, wrapped in yellowed envelopes, lay letters written in careful hand. Some were from comrades long gone, their words brimming with gratitude. "You pulled me from the river that night. I never thanked you enough." Others were from strangers who had once read his story in local papers, thanking him for his service, his sacrifice, his strength. There were letters from students he had quietly mentored, from men and women who had walked straighter because he had once guided them. Each letter carried the echo of lives touched by his presence, lives his family never knew existed. Beneath them were newspaper clippings, brittle with age, their ink fading but still legible. Headlines that once spoke his name with respect. A soldier commended for bravery, a worker who had organized relief when a flood nearly destroyed their town, a man who had helped build bridges that still carried traffic decades later. The photographs attached to those clippings showed a younger man, shoulders square, eyes steady, a man who looked nothing like the quiet figure they now dismissed at the table. His family never read those words, never asked about those days. To them, history began only where their own lives had started. Deeper in the drawer rested medals, tucked away in small boxes lined with velvet worn thin, bronze, silver, even one gold-plated, tarnished but undeniable. Each one carried the weight of nights spent under fire, of missions completed against impossible odds, of courage that left scars he never spoke of. He had hidden them not because he was ashamed, but because he did not believe in parading sacrifice. His pride was quiet, his dignity too great to be hung on walls for show. But their silence did not mean they had no value. They were proof, silent but eternal, of who he was. And then, at the very bottom, lay photographs, grainy black and white, edges curled with time. Him in uniform, standing beside men who looked at him not as just grandpa, but as a brother, a leader. Him younger, paint on his hands, building the foundations of a community hall that still stood. Him carrying his daughter as a child, her tiny hand clutching his collar, her smile brighter than the hunger he had hidden from her. He had kept those photographs not to remind himself, but because he believed one day they might matter to someone else. He had hoped his family would ask, would want to know. They never had. So he kept it all hidden, his legacy locked away in drawers that gathered dust. To them, he was simply an old man with a fading memory and a tattered coat. But in truth, he was a library of courage, sacrifice, and endurance, waiting quietly to be opened. He never spoke of it, never demanded they listen, never forced his history into their shallow conversations. He let them laugh, let them dismiss him, let them believe he was nothing more than what they saw. Yet in his heart he knew the day would come when those letters, those clippings, those medals, those photographs would speak louder than his silence ever could. The truth was waiting, patient as snow, and when it arrived, it would not ask for their permission. It would demand their reverence. The letter arrived on a gray morning, folded neatly in an envelope, stamped with the seal of the university. It was addressed in formal script, his full name written clearly, a name his family barely spoke anymore, a name that felt heavier on paper than it did in their casual tones of dismissal. He opened it slowly, his hands careful not to tear the edges, and as his eyes moved across the words, something inside him stirred that had been quiet for too long. They had not forgotten. Somewhere beyond the walls of his home, beyond the careless whispers of "just Grandpa," the world still remembered. The invitation was precise, respectful, and warm. They asked him to attend a conference on leadership and resilience, to sit as an honored guest, to allow others to hear his story, not the fragments told and then mocked at his dinner table, but the full truth of his journey, the sacrifices, the victories, the humanity that had marked his path. They wrote of his service, his work, his legacy. They spoke of the bridges that still stood, of the lives that had been changed by his hand. To them, he was not invisible. He was necessary. He read it twice, then a third time, his eyes pausing on the line that called him an inspiration. The word was foreign on his tongue after so many years of silence, yet it rang inside him with a kind of ache. Inspiration, not burden, not relic, not just grandpa, inspiration. He let the words settle in his chest, filling spaces long emptied by disregard. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the pocket of his worn coat. He did not announce it at breakfast. He did not clear his throat at the table and say, "They invited me." He knew the reaction that would follow. The son-in-law would scoff, calling it a small gesture, something ceremonial with no real meaning. The daughter would force a smile, then turn back to her chores. The grandchildren would barely look up from their phones. They would not see it for what it was, and he would not offer them the chance to dismiss it. His pride would not allow him to hand them this piece of dignity, only to have them crush it under laughter. So he said nothing. He carried it quietly, like a flame cupped in his hands, protecting it from the winds of their indifference. Each day he touched the envelope in his pocket as if to reassure himself that it was real, that the world beyond still knew his worth, that somewhere people still spoke his name with reverence. And in that secret he found strength. At dinner, when the conversation swirled around him and his presence was once again pushed to the margins, he let their words pass. He thought of the hall where he would soon sit, the lights that would shine on him not as an afterthought but as a guest of honor. He thought of strangers rising to applaud the life they had never lived, the story they had never forgotten. His family laughed at their own jokes, and he, for the first time in years, felt no sting. He had already been called something greater than they could imagine. The letter remained in his coat, its folds softening with time, its words memorized in his heart. He would go, quietly, without announcement, without seeking approval. He would go because he did not need them to see him anymore. The world had already extended its hand, and when he took it, their laughter would mean nothing. The morning of the event came without ceremony. He rose before the others, as he always did, his steps soft on the floorboards so as not to disturb anyone. The house was still, save for the distant hum of a refrigerator and the muffled rhythm of his family's sleep. He dressed in silence, buttoning his shirt with deliberate care, smoothing the sleeves of his old coat, the one they laughed at. He reached into the pocket and touched the folded letter, now worn soft at the creases from the times he had unfolded and refolded it, memorizing every line. It was more than paper. It was proof. Proof that the world beyond his own home still knew his name, still remembered what he had done, still cared enough to call him back into the light. He tied his shoes slowly, each knot holding more weight than the leather could bear. Then he stood at the doorway, pausing for a moment to look back at the house. His daughter's laughter still lived in those walls. His grandchildren's voices still rang in the rooms, but so did the sting of dismissal, the echo of just grandpa. He felt both the love and the wound together, a contradiction that had defined his later years, but this day was not theirs to define. It was his. He stepped outside into the cool morning air. The street was quiet, the sky painted in muted grays and soft blues, the world not yet awake. He walked slowly but steadily, his cane tapping against the pavement, each step measured but firm. To anyone watching, it might have looked like the walk of an old man taking his daily exercise. And that was how his family would explain it later when they noticed his absence. He probably went out for some air. They would not imagine that his path was leading him to a place where the truth would finally speak. The city stirred as he moved closer to the hall. He passed shopkeepers pulling up shutters, Young people hurrying with coffee cups in hand, cars humming to life along the roads. No one stopped him. No one pointed. No one knew that the man in the worn coat was carrying a legacy folded in his pocket, a legacy about to unfold in front of strangers who would honor it more than his own kin had. And that anonymity was strangely comforting. It let him walk quietly, unnoticed, until the moment the world would be forced to notice. When he reached the university hall, the building rose before him in solemn majesty. Columns tall and steady, steps wide and welcoming, banners hanging proudly from its walls. He paused at the bottom of the steps, breathing in deeply, feeling the weight of years pressing against his shoulders. How many steps had he climbed in his life, carrying burdens heavier than this? How many doors had he opened, not knowing what waited on the other side? This, he realized, was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of everything he had already lived, finally seen by eyes willing to look. He climbed slowly, steadying himself on the railing, his heart steady despite the ache in his knees. At the doors, attendants waited, scanning the list of honored guests. When he gave his name, their eyes lit up with recognition, and they straightened their posture, nodding with respect. "Welcome, sir," they said softly, opening the door wide for him. Inside, the light was warm, the air filled with anticipation. He stepped into that space, not as a relic, not as a burden, not as just grandpa, but as a man whose time had never truly passed. Back at home, his family would sit down to their routines, unaware of where he had gone. They would sip their coffee, scroll their phones, carry on with their day. They would not know that even now, as they dismissed him again without thought, their father, their grandfather, was walking into a hall where his story would be told to strangers, who would rise to their feet in reverence. He walked down the corridor toward the stage, his silence steady, his dignity intact. The truth was waiting for him, and for the first time in years, he felt ready to meet it. The hall was filled with a quiet expectancy. Rows of faces turned toward the stage where the guest speaker stood beneath the lights. The air carried the solemn weight of an occasion that mattered, the kind of silence that says people have come not just to listen, but to witness. The speaker, a younger man with graying hair at the temples and a voice trained for clarity, adjusted the microphone. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded a sheet of paper. He paused before speaking, his eyes scanning the room, then settling on the front row where the old man sat in his worn coat, his posture steady but humble, as though he did not belong to the center of attention but could not deny its pull. The first words were formal, a welcome to those gathered. Then the speaker's tone shifted, growing softer, more personal. He explained that he had been asked not only to speak of leadership, but to tell the story of someone whose life embodied it. He lifted the paper, but his eyes did not stay on the text. They drifted toward the old man, and something in his gaze broke. His voice wavered as he began. "This is the story of a man who saved lives." The room leaned forward. The men on stage spoke of a battlefield decades past, where chaos reigned and death lingered in the air. He told of a soldier who carried comrades to safety while bullets cracked overhead, who ignored his own wounds to shield others, who turned despair into survival. His voice shook as he read, pausing once to steady himself. The audience listened, spellbound, as the image of a quiet hero began to form before them. He spoke of years after the war, when the soldier returned not to glory, but to labor. He told of bridges built with his hands, structures that still carried people across rivers today, monuments of strength that stood even as time wore them down. He told of community halls raised stone by stone, of nights spent teaching young apprentices, of mornings given to work that would outlast him. Every sentence was a brushstroke painting the truth his family had refused to see. This man's life was not a shadow. It was a foundation. The speaker's voice cracked openly now, emotion breaking through the formal cadence of his speech. "This man," he said, his eyes shining as they met the old man's, "did not ask for recognition. He did not demand applause. He gave, he built, He sacrificed quietly, and because of him, lives were saved, futures were made, generations were given hope. His hands trembled as he lowered the paper, his throat tightening around the words. Tears welled, not staged, not rehearsed, but drawn out by the sheer weight of telling a story so full of courage and humility. The audience was silent, utterly still, their breaths caught in reverence. Some lowered their heads, others wiped at their eyes, not because they knew the old man personally, but because the story carried truth so raw it demanded respect. And at the center of it all sat the man himself, quiet, unflinching, his eyes lowered to the floor. He did not seek their gaze. He did not bask in the honor. He had lived his life without applause, and though the world was finally offering it, he did not reach for it greedily. His silence, as always, was his crown. In that moment, the guest speaker faltered completely. His voice broke, his shoulders shook, and he pressed a hand to his face, weeping openly in front of the audience. Not from pity, not from ceremony, but from awe, because even in telling the story, he felt the immensity of what it meant. He cried not for the struggles endured, but for the greatness overlooked, the quiet dignity ignored for too long. And in the front row, the old man sat, as he always had, still, humble, dignified. The family who had dismissed him as just Grandpa had not yet realized the depth of what was happening. But strangers in that hall, with tears in their eyes, already knew. They did not see an old man in a frayed coat. They saw the weight of a life that had carried others, the worth of a name that would not be forgotten, the strength of a legacy that no laughter could erase. They had not come out of reverence. They came because it was convenient, because the daughter thought it would look nice to be seen supporting a university event, because the son-in-law liked to appear connected, because the grandchildren were curious what kind of boring lecture Grandpa had wandered into. They entered late, taking seats toward the back, restless, distracted, whispering among themselves. They expected formality, speeches, perhaps names of people they had never heard of. What they did not expect was to hear their own blood woven into the fabric of history. At first they barely listened. The speaker's voice, steady but trembling, spoke of war, of fire, of men carried to safety. The son-in-law glanced at his phone. The grandchildren rolled their eyes. But then slowly the details began to pierce through. A soldier, wounded but unyielding. A man who built bridges that still carried travelers. A worker who gave his strength to communities that others had abandoned. The daughter froze, her lips parting as recognition struck. She knew those details. She knew those places. She knew who the story belonged to. Her heart sank. She had laughed when he spoke of those days at home. She had nodded silently when her husband dismissed him as outdated. She had let her children mock him as just Grandpa, never lifting her voice to defend him. And now, here, in front of strangers, his life unfolded with grandeur she had denied him. Tears pricked her eyes as shame burned her cheeks. She dared not look toward the front row where her father sat, small and quiet, because to meet his gaze would mean facing the truth. She had betrayed him with her silence. The son-in-law stiffened, his jaw tightening. He had built his pride on being the voice of authority in the family, the one with opinions louder than anyone else's. And yet here was the world, an entire hall, rising in reverence not for him, but for the man he had dismissed as irrelevant. His face flushed with panic, then anger, then something hollow, fear. Fear of how small he looked now, how false his arrogance appeared, when measured against a life lived with such weight. He clenched his fists, but there was no fight to be had. The truth spoke louder than him, louder than any word he could summon. The grandchildren fidgeted in their seats, their faces paling as they realized the man on the stage was speaking about the same figure they had laughed at, the same man whose coat they mocked, whose stories they rolled their eyes at. Each sentence was like a blow. He had saved lives. He had built. He had endured. He had given. Their laughter at home replayed in their minds, twisted now into cruelty. Shame pressed down on them so heavily they wanted to shrink, to vanish into the crowd. They looked toward their mother, but her eyes were wet, her face stricken. There was no comfort to be found. And in the front row their grandfather sat in silence, his head bowed slightly, his hands folded calmly. He did not turn to look at them, did not seek their recognition, did not demand their repentance. He sat steady, letting the words flow over him like a river that had taken a lifetime to reach. The applause, the tears, the reverence, they were not for pride, they were for truth. He had not come to punish his family, nor to shame them publicly. He had come because the world had finally remembered. But from the back of the hall, his family saw something they could never unsee. The man they had dismissed as just Grandpa was not a relic to be hidden at the edge of a table. He was a hero, a builder, a bearer of legacy, a man whose name strangers whispered with awe while they sat drowning in regret. In that moment, the gulf between how they had treated him and who he truly was stretched so wide it could never be closed with words. Their eyes stayed fixed on him, and the weight of their shame was unbearable. So he sat in the first row, steady and composed, his posture upright but unassuming, the worn fabric of his coat folded neatly across his lap. The lights from the stage bathed his face in a soft glow, but he did not flinch beneath them. Around him the audience leaned forward, hushed, reverent, their eyes shifting between the speaker's trembling words and the man who lived them. Applause swelled like waves breaking against the shore, then quieted again as more of his story unfolded. Yet through it all, he remained still, a figure of calm dignity, untouched by noise. He did not turn to seek his family's eyes. He did not search for their recognition. He had no need. Behind him, in the back rows, his family shifted uneasily, their shame visible even from a distance. The son-in-law's pride collapsed into a restless stiffness, his jaw tight, his shoulders hunched forward as though trying to shield himself from the truth pressing down. The daughter wept silently, her head bowed, her hands clenched in her lap, every tear an echo of years she had chosen silence over defense. The grandchildren sat rigid, their restless energy drained into a hollow stillness. They wanted to disappear into the crowd, to vanish before the eyes of strangers who now whispered his name with reverence. But they could not. They were trapped in the truth, forced to watch the man they mocked sit crowned in dignity. And he did nothing. That was what cut deepest. No grand speeches, no accusing glances, no gestures of triumph. Only silence. Silence that grew heavier with every clap, with every word of praise from the stage, with every respectful nod cast in his direction. Silence that reminded them he did not need to raise his voice to be heard, that his presence was enough to undo their arrogance. His silence thundered louder than any fury could have, stripping them bare without a single word. The audience rose in a standing ovation, the sound rolling through the hall like a storm. People turned toward him, clapping, some with tears shining in their eyes, honoring the man whose story had just been laid before them. Still he did not rise, did not bask, did not gesture for more. He simply lowered his head, his expression calm, as though acknowledging something greater than himself. He carried the applause with humility, letting it fall not as a crown on his head, but as a blessing he had never sought, yet finally received. For his family, the silence was unbearable. They longed for him to lash out, to shout, to confront them, because anger they could excuse. Anger they could fight against, explain away. But silence, they had no defense against silence. In it, they saw themselves too clearly. The mockery in the attic, the laughter at the table, the whispered words, just Grandpa. His silence forced them to confront the cruelty of their own voices, the blindness of their own hearts. They had reduced him to nothing, and now the world was lifting him higher than they could ever reach. He sat still in the first row, unmoving, dignified. He did not turn around. He did not need to. His silence had already spoken everything that needed to be said. The ovation rose like a tide, unrelenting, washing through the hall until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the sound. People stood not because they were told to, not because protocol demanded it, but because reverence compelled them. It was the kind of applause that is born not of habit but of awe, the recognition of something greater than the moment itself. The speaker on stage lowered his notes, unable to continue, his eyes wet as he joined the crowd in honoring the man seated quietly in the first row. He did not rise. He did not wave. He remained where he was, his back straight, his hands folded loosely in his lap, his head bowed slightly. The lights caught the deep lines of his face. The marks of years lived not in vanity but in sacrifice. And though he made no gesture to invite them, people began to approach. First one, then another, men and women who felt compelled to thank him. A professor bent low, her voice trembling with gratitude as she took his hand. A student, no older than his own grandchildren, knelt beside him with tears in his eyes and whispered that he hoped to live even a fraction as bravely. A man he did not know, but whose family had once crossed the bridge he built, pressed his hand firmly, unable to find words, letting silence speak for him. He had asked for nothing. He had announced nothing. Yet respect, long denied, returned to him freely, carried on the sincerity of strangers who owed him nothing but gave him everything. Each handshake, each bowed head, each tear shed at his feet was proof that dignity, once dismissed by those closest to him, had never been lost. It had only been waiting for the right light to shine upon it again. From the back his family watched, frozen. The son-in-law's face was hard, his pride collapsing under the sight of strangers treating the man he mocked as a giant. The daughter's tears flowed openly now, grief and shame tangled together, for she knew these words, these gestures, could have been hers, should have been hers, but she had chosen silence instead. The grandchildren stared wide-eyed as students their own age revered the grandfather they had called outdated, irrelevant, just grandpa. The contrast was unbearable. They sat in their shame, unable to move, as strangers gave him the love they had withheld, and he, through it all, remained calm. He did not gloat. He did not search the crowd for the eyes of his family. He received the gratitude with humility. Each nod of thanks met with a gentle incline of his head, each hand taken with steady grace. He knew this was not victory in the sense of conquest. This was something higher, justice without fury, dignity restored not through demands, but through truth itself. The applause did not stop quickly. It lingered, echoing, sustained by hearts unwilling to let go of the moment. And in that hall, the man they had once silenced became the voice of something eternal. Respect cannot be forced, cannot be erased, cannot be denied forever. It finds its way back, even if it must travel through decades of shadows. And as people pressed around him with gratitude he never asked for, he understood that what had been mocked in the quiet of his own home was now celebrated in the open light of the world. They sat in the back, pinned to their seats as if the air itself had grown heavy around them. The hall still thundered with applause. Strangers still pressed forward to take his hand, to bow their heads, to whisper gratitude into his ear. And yet, for his family, every cheer was a blade turned inward, every word of reverence a reminder of what they had thrown away. The grandchildren, who once laughed at his old coat and rolled their eyes at his stories, could not bring themselves to look at him now. They dropped their gaze to their laps, ashamed, their phones clenched useless in their hands. For the first time, they felt the full weight of their mockery. The man they had dismissed as irrelevant was being honored as a hero before hundreds of eyes, and they could not bear to lift their own. The daughter bit her lip until it bled, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. She remembered every moment she had chosen silence, every time she had turned away instead of standing by her father's side. She remembered her complicity at the table, the way she had let his words be drowned out, the way she had let her husband's voice erase him, and now she sat watching others celebrate the very life she had ignored, knowing she could never undo the years she had wasted. Regret filled her throat until she could hardly breathe. Her tears came not only from pride, but from the agony of knowing that strangers had given him what she, his own child, had withheld. The son-in-law's face hardened, his pride collapsing under the weight of truth. His words, "It's not your time anymore," rang back in his head like a curse. He had said them lightly, casually, as if flicking dust from a sleeve. Now they sounded like a verdict upon himself, a judgment that stripped him bare before everyone in that hall. It was not the old man who had been living out of time. It was him. He was the one irrelevant now, his arrogance crushed beneath the quiet dignity of the man he had mocked. For the first time he felt the sting of being small, of being exposed, of being wrong with no defense. On stage, the speaker still wept as he told the story, unable to contain the emotion that poured through every sentence. The audience listened with reverence, their eyes on the man in the first row, not on his family cowering in the back. That contrast was unbearable. He, steady, calm, silent in his humility. They, restless, trembling, crushed by shame. The hall became a mirror, showing them not just who their grandfather was, but who they had been. And in that mirror, they saw everything they wished they could erase. But the old man did not turn. He did not look back to meet their eyes. His silence was heavier than fury, deeper than scorn. He had no need to accuse them. The world was already doing it for him. Every handshake, every bowed head, every tear shed at his feet was a judgment they could not escape. Respect, denied at home, had found him anyway. And now it rose so high, so undeniable, that their shame had nowhere to hide. Grandchildren lowered their heads deeper. The daughter's lips trembled. The son-in-law clenched his fists. And still the applause carried on, echoing in their ears like the verdict of history itself. They had called him just Grandpa, but he had been more, so much more, and they were the last to know. He could have turned to them, could have lifted his hand and pointed out the shame they carried, could have spoken aloud every wound they had given him, but he did not. His silence was not weakness, it was power. He remained seated in the first row, his eyes steady, his hands calm, his face serene. The world's recognition had already spoken louder than his voice ever could. To accuse them now would have been to step down from the dignity he had finally been granted, and so he let truth itself do the work. The applause, the bowed heads, the tears of strangers, these were his shield and his crown. He did not need to punish his family, for punishment had already found them. Every cheer that rose for him was a reminder of their neglect. Every handshake extended toward him was a reflection of what they had denied him. Every whispered thank you from strangers was a reproach sharper than any words he could summon. The truth revealed at last was their judgment. In the back of the hall, his daughter wept quietly, unable to stop the flood of regret. The grandchildren hid their faces, ashamed to meet anyone's eyes. The son-in-law sat frozen, his pride cracked and hollow. And still the old man did not look at them, did not offer even a glance of accusation. His silence was justice enough. It was heavier than fury, deeper than scorn, more lasting than anger. He had lived through battles, through hunger, through labor that broke lesser men, and he had never begged for pity. He would not start now. His life was his answer. His dignity, unbroken, was the only statement he needed. In that hall, truth had finally risen, and it demanded no revenge. It only demanded respect. The days that followed carried his name farther than he ever imagined. Newspapers ran articles not about a forgotten veteran or an old man in a worn coat, but about a life of courage and service that had quietly shaped the lives of others. Headlines printed his story with reverence. Photographs captured him sitting in the front row as the hall rose in applause. His name, once confined to dust in drawers and whispered only in his own memory, now stood in bold letters for the world to see. The dignity that had been denied at his own table was restored in ink and print across a city. At the university, a portrait was commissioned. They painted him not as a frail elder, but as he truly was, a man of endurance, a builder, a quiet pillar of strength. It was hung in the main hall, high enough that students passing beneath would look up and wonder, and teachers would pause to explain. Beneath it, a plaque carried his name and a simple line. His silence was strength, his life was legacy. It became a place where young artists and leaders paused to take photographs, where visitors stood in respect. The portrait outlived the laughter of his family. It belonged to history now. At home, his family could no longer call him just Grandpa. They spoke of him differently, hesitantly at first, then with the reverence they should have carried all along. His daughter introduced him as my father, whose story was told at the university. The grandchildren, once quick to mock, now whispered his name with pride when teachers at their school mentioned the article. Even the son-in-law, silent and chastened, no longer dared to speak of him as irrelevant. He was no longer only the old man at the edge of the table. He was the man whose shadow stretched into history. Yet he himself remained unchanged. He wore the same coat, sat in the same chair by the window, kept the same silence that had always been his shield. Recognition had come at last, but he had not sought it. What mattered to him was not the applause or the portrait, but the truth itself, that his life had not been erased, that his dignity had endured every insult, and that the world at last had seen him as he was. His crown was not of gold or medals or words. It was the dignity that had carried him through betrayal, and the knowledge that respect, though delayed, had found its way back to him. Years passed, and the memory of that night did not fade. It grew. The speech that once trembled through a hall full of strangers became retold in classrooms, quoted in essays, passed down in lectures about courage and humility. Students who had not even been born when the man lived sat in rows and listened to professors recall the story of the quiet figure in the front row, the one who had carried others through war, who had built with his own hands, who had never asked for recognition and yet became the symbol of dignity itself. His story was no longer just his. It belonged to the generations that followed, a parable of endurance, of humility, of respect that cannot be erased. Children walked beneath his portrait at the university, and some paused to look longer, asking teachers, "Who was he?" The answer was always given with reverence. He was the man whose silence thundered louder than mockery, the man who bore humiliation without anger, the man who taught that worth is not measured by applause at home, but by the truth that endures beyond it. Letters continued to be written in his name, scholarships awarded to students who carried nothing but hunger and hope, just as he once had. His name opened doors not for him anymore, but for others, an invisible hand guiding the young into futures brighter than his own had been. At home, the change was quieter but no less real. His grandchildren grew into adults carrying the memory of the day when strangers had risen to honor the man they had laughed at. They no longer spoke the words, just Grandpa. Instead, they carried his story like a shield, telling others about the day they sat in shame at the back of a hall and realized they had lived beside greatness without seeing it. His daughter, older now herself, spoke of him with tears that were no longer only regret, but reverence, telling her children's children that their great-grandfather had been more than the wrinkles on his face, more than the silence at their table. He had been a pillar, a builder, a man remembered long after the laughter of mockery was gone. Even the son-in-law, once smug in his arrogance, never dared to dismiss his name again. Silence had already condemned him, and he spent his years living in its echo. The old man was gone by then, laid to rest with little ceremony, just as he would have wished. But in truth, he was not gone at all. His story lived in the lecture halls, in the voices of young scholars, in the applause that echoed still in memory. His name carved in brass beneath his portrait, his life recorded in archives, his legacy alive in the lives of students who received scholarships they never expected. This was how he remained. The world did not remember the whispers of just Grandpa. Those words, once cutting, had dissolved into dust. What the world remembered was the hall that rose to its feet, the guest speaker who wept while telling his story, the dignity that crowned a man who needed no crown. And so years later, when his name was spoken, it was not with dismissal, but with reverence. His grandchildren never forgot the lesson carved into their hearts on that night. That dignity does not age, that worth is not erased by arrogance, that memory outlasts mockery. They taught it to their own children, who grew up knowing that their great-grandfather had been more than a figure in the corner of family dinners. He had been a man who turned silence into legacy. The legacy of his story was this: that respect cannot be stolen, cannot be erased, cannot be delayed forever. It may sleep for a time, buried under laughter and neglect, but it rises, unshakable, undeniable, and when it does, it outlives all betrayal. His name became that truth, eternal, proof that dignity, once lived, can never die.